A 30mm shell screamed over the limestone ridge at 3:30 a.m. on February 17, 1979, and Lieutenant Nguyen Van Hai heard the earth crack open before he felt it, a shudder that climbed through his boots, his knees, his ribs, and nested behind his eyes like a fist made of sound. This matters because what unfolded over the next 28 days would redefine Vietnam's northern frontier, turn border towns into graveyards, and teach Hanoi that victory over the Americans did not guarantee peace. The war with China, brief, savage, and still debated, became a crucible that tested whether a nation could defend itself on two fronts, one against the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the other against the vast People's Liberation Army massing along 600 kilometers of karst and jungle. The barrage rolled down the ridgeline like a collapsing wall. 30 to 40 minutes of concentrated fire shattered border posts from Pa Nam Kum in the west to Mong Khai on the coast. Lieutenant Hai, commanding a militia squad in Zhongjung, pressed his face into the sandbags of his bunker and smelled wet earth, cordite, and the faint sweetness of crushed star anise from a nearby spice stall reduced to splinters. The night air, cold for February, hovering between 8 and 15 degrees Celsius, carried the drizzle that clung to everything, turning dust to paste and making every breath taste metallic. Behind him, a radio man hunched over a Soviet R-105. Batteries warmed in his armpits to keep the charge alive. The handset crackled. Static. Then a voice from Lạng Sơn command. Hold positions. Reinforcements inbound 72 hours. 72 hours. Hai didn't laugh, but he wanted to. The nearest regular division was still peeling off from Cambodia, racing north on roads cratered by years of American bombs and now choked with refugees. Vietnam's defense relied first on roughly 30,000 border guards, militia and local forces scattered across Lạng Sơn, Cao Bằng and Lào Cai provinces. They were farmers in uniform, shopkeepers who knew how to strip a DSHK heavy machine gun, grandmothers who remembered the French and had buried claymores under their garden plots. Beijing had mobilized 9 army corps. Historians debate the exact count, but estimates range from 200,000 to 300,000 troops, supported by over 2,000 tanks and armoured personnel carriers, plus 1,500 artillery pieces. The math was brutal, and everyone knew it. In Hanoi, senior leadership, Lê Duan, Truong Chin, Pham Văn Dong, framed the fight as Bảo vệ Tổ quốc, defending the fatherland, after years of Chinese pressure over Vietnam's intervention in Cambodia. General Van Tien Dung directed emergency redeployments. Veteran divisions with names that carried weight, the 3rd Sao Vang, the 338th, the 346th, began the long push north on Highways 1, 2 and 4, but they would not arrive in time for the first terrible week. Hai climbed to the firing slit and peered through the fog. February drizzle clung to the karst ridges, turning visibility into a gamble. 50 meters, maybe 100 on a good stretch. Perfect for ambush. His squad had wired the Hu Nhi Quan, the Friendship Gate, with explosives 3 days earlier, a bitter irony not lost on anyone. When the PLA tanks breached, the blast would fold the arch like paper at less than 30 meters. He could picture it now, the roar, the dust, the screaming metal. Loudspeakers in the border towns looped mobilization calls. Hai had heard them every night for a week, the same scratchy recording urging vigilance, sacrifice, readiness. Youth volunteers, Thang Nguyen Shung Fong, repaired cratered roads by kerosene lamp between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m., working in silence except for the scrape of shovels and the wet slap of mud. Civilians in Lạng Sơn packed rice in 2-kilogram cloth sacks, hid family altars in caves and led buffalo into ravines to deny draft animals to the invaders. An old woman in Van Quan had told Hai that she remembered doing the same thing in 1945, and again in 1954, and now here they were. The shelling stopped. Silence dropped like a curtain, thick and suffocating. Hai's ears rang. He tasted copper. Then came the rumble, low, mechanical, a sound that built like thunder rolling across the valley. Tanks, hundreds of them, maybe thousands if you counted the entire front. Type 59s and 62s, each one a steel coffin waiting to burn. His radio man whispered, "They're coming." Hai checked his AK. 40 rounds. He had 3 magazines left and a single B-41 rocket-propelled grenade leaning against the sandbags. His squad, 12 men and 1 19-year-old woman from the Dan Quan Tuve, the women's militia, crouched in spider holes dug under bamboo groves and stone pigsties. They would fight in company-sized packets, 60 to 120 men dispersed by village, using the terrain the way their fathers had against the French and the Americans. The PLA would use massed infantry rushes covered by 122mm and 152mm guns. High had seen the doctrine in captured manuals. It was brutal, effective, and it would cost them everything. He thought about his wife in Hanoi, 200 kilometers south, and wondered if she'd received his last letter. The lantern-lit words had smelled of damp ink and coal smoke from the train boilers. 5 to 10 days for delivery, if the trains still ran, if the bridges still stood, if... Imagine crouching in that bunker, the weight of the rifle in your hands, the cold seeping through your boots, and knowing that in minutes the horizon would fill with fire. The first Chinese tank broke through the fog at dawn, its turret swiveling toward the gate, and Lieutenant Hai pressed the detonator. The blast turned the Friendship Gate into a fountain of concrete and rebar, and when the dust cleared, Lieutenant Hai saw the lead tank slewed sideways, its treads chewed apart, black smoke pouring from the engine grill. What happened next would determine whether Vietnam's northern border held or collapsed. The PLA had organized its invasion along 3 primary axes, each designed to exploit highways and river valleys that cut through the karst terrain like knife wounds. The western thrust aimed for Lào Cai in the Hoang Lien Son Highlands. The central push targeted Cao Bằng through Nguyen Binh. The eastern spearhead drove toward Lạng Sơn via Zhongjiang and Kỳ Lua. Each column penetrated 15 to 50 kilometers deep in the first 72 hours, grinding forward with the inevitability of a landslide. In Lào Cai, the fighting erupted around the Viet Trung border market, a sprawl of wooden stalls where traders had sold silk, tea, and smuggled cigarettes for decades. By February 20th, witnesses counted over 20 burned shop fronts. The smell of scorched rice and melted rubber hung low in the morning fog, mixing with the cordite stink of overnight shelling. Vietnamese defenders, mostly local militia and border guards, had fortified the market's stone buildings, turning second-floor windows into sniper nests and alleyways into kill zones. The PLA responded with Type 63 107mm rocket salvos that turned entire blocks into rubble. Roof tiles shattered, walls breathed dust. The street dogs stopped barking after the first night. Ethnic Nung and Thai militia guided Vietnamese companies through the limestone hoc jar, pockets and caves that honeycombed the ridges, marking safe paths with tufts of straw tied to thorn scrub. These guides knew every fissure, every blind draw, every shelf of rock that could hide a dozen men. They moved barefoot in the drizzle, their feet calloused and silent, and they whispered directions in dialects the PLA interpreters couldn't pass. One Tay scout, a man named Lee, led a platoon through a vertical crack no wider than a man's shoulders, emerging behind a Chinese mortar team at dawn. The ambush lasted 90 seconds. No prisoners. The central thrust toward Cao Bang met a different kind of resistance. Vietnamese local forces detonated hillside rock slides on Route 4A, using pre-positioned charges buried in the talus slopes. A 200-meter blockage delayed a regiment-sized column for over 9 hours. Engineers tried to bulldoze the debris, but Vietnamese snipers picked off the drivers at 300 meters, forcing the PLA to dig by hand under sporadic rifle fire. The bodies piled up in the ditch beside the road, covered with tarps that flapped in the wind. By nightfall, the column had advanced less than a kilometer. On the eastern axis, Zhongjiang became the hinge. The town sat astride Highway 1, the main artery linking Hanoi to the Chinese border, and its loss would open a direct route to Lạng Sơn. Vietnamese defenders wired mines from earlier wars, American M14 toe poppers, POMS-type fragmentation devices, and locally made bamboo stake traps into garden plots and footpaths. The PLA advanced cautiously, but caution cost time, and time allowed Vietnamese regular units to close the gap. The 3rd Division Sao Vang, veterans of Cambodia and older campaigns, began arriving in piecemeal battalions on February 19th and 20th, digging in along the high ground south of the town. Chinese logistics strained under the terrain, PLA mortar crews pushed 81mm and 120mm rounds by human pack lines, men hauling 25 to 35 kilogram loads over 6 to 8 kilometers of ankle-deep mud. Captured diaries later revealed the exhaustion: split boots, blistered shoulders, rations reduced to sesame cakes and garlic cloves. One entry, dated February 21st, read simply, "We were promised a safe return. No one believes it now." Vietnamese commanders prioritized anti-armor kill zones at stone bridges and hairpin turns. White chalk X marks appeared on walls overnight, pre-ranged aim points for B-40 and B-41 rocket-propelled grenades. The teams practiced the drill until it became muscle memory. Wait for the tank to cross the X, fire at the turret ring or rear engine deck, then crawl backward through spider holes before the infantry could react. Standard engagement range, 20 to 80 meters. Any farther, and the warhead might not penetrate. Any closer, and the backblast would give away the position. On the Lào Cai axis, the Thak back area saw hill-to-hill assaults that dissolved into grenade exchanges across wet fern gullies. Fog reduced visibility to 20 to 50 meters, turning the fight into a claustrophobic brawl. Men stumbled into each other at arm's length, bayonets fixed, firing blind into the mist. A Vietnamese sergeant named Tran recalled throwing a grenade and hearing it bounce off a tree, the explosion so close that shrapnel peppered his helmet. He lived. The three men beside him didn't. The Red River rail line, Hanoi to Zhongjiang, was cut within 24 hours. Vietnamese sappers blew at least 7 bridges, including the Kai Kung River spans, using satchel charges of 3 to 5 kilograms of TNT with bamboo handles and fuses cut to 5 to 7 seconds. The blasts were timed for maximum chaos. Dawn departures, midnight resupply runs, any moment when a train might be crossing. One engineer, a woman named Phuong, described the technique years later with clinical precision. You counted the seconds, you ran, you never looked back. If you looked back, you hesitated. If you hesitated, you died. Soviet support materialized as Antonov transports offloaded ammunition at Gia Lam airfield outside Hanoi. Soviet warships loitered in the Gulf of Tonkin, their presence a silent warning that Moscow was watching. But no Soviet troops fought. Both air forces stayed grounded. Vietnam kept MiG-21s at Noi Bai on alert, fearing Chinese surface-to-air missiles and a wider escalation that might drag the superpowers into direct conflict. The result was a rare no-air power war, fought with artillery, infantry, and the brutal geometry of terrain. Civilian evacuation became its own nightmare. Refugee counts vary. Vietnamese reports claim tens of thousands fled south of the Khi Kung, but the trains south from Bac Giang ran at night with lights blacked out, packed so tightly that passengers stood in the aisles for 12-hour journeys. One woman from Lạng Sơn remembered her daughter vomiting from motion sickness and fear, the smell of bile mixing with the coal smoke that seeped through every crack. She remembered the silence. No one spoke. They just swayed with the train and listened for explosions. How would you choose? Stay and fight for your home, or flee and live with the shame? By February 22nd, the PLA had driven deep into 3 provinces, but they had not broken through. The Vietnamese lines bent, fractured, bled, but they did not collapse. And in Hanoi, General Van Tien Dung was already moving pieces on the map, redirecting divisions from Cambodia, pulling battalions from Haiphong, gambling everything on a counter-offensive that would either stop the invasion or destroy what remained of the army. The question was not whether the Chinese could advance, it was whether the Vietnamese could make them pay enough to stop. The basement of the Lạng Sơn primary school had been a storage room for textbooks and broken desks, but by February 23, 1979, it held 43 wounded men, and the kind of silence that comes when screaming costs too much energy. Vietnamese casualty care depended on cave aid stations and improvised field hospitals carved from whatever structures survived the shelling. Medical supplies were rationed with surgical precision, chloroquine for malaria suppression, sulfonamides for infection, boiled bandages reused until they disintegrated. In the first week, the standard allocation dropped to 1 package per 8 to 10 wounded. Nurses learned triage by necessity, marking chests with chalk, O for operate, T for transfer, M for morphine and monitor. By day 10, morphine ran out in some wards. After that, men bit through leather straps or their own knuckles. A nurse named Hang worked the Lạng Sơn school basement in 12-hour shifts that bled into 16, then 20. She was 24 years old. She had trained in Hanoi and imagined herself in a clean hospital with tile floors and proper lighting. Instead, she worked by kerosene lamp, her hands stained rust brown, her apron stiff with dried blood. The sweet metallic smell became unbearable in the closed space, iron and decay mixing with sweat and fear. She kept a small bottle of fish sauce in her pocket and dabbed it under her nose to mask the stench. Years later, she could not eat nuoc mam without tasting that basement. The wounded came in waves, delivered by stretcher teams who navigated cratered roads and minefields in darkness. Some injuries were clean, through and throughs from rifle rounds, shrapnel cuts that could be stitched and bandaged. Others were catastrophic. A tank crewman arrived with third-degree burns covering 60% of his body, his skin sloughing off in sheets. Hang gave him morphine, her last vial, and held his hand until he stopped breathing. She was still holding it when the next stretcher arrived. Triage became mechanical. She stopped learning names, faces blurred together. A boy with half his jaw missing. An old militia man with a sucking chest wound who kept apologizing for bleeding on the floor. A woman from the Dan Quan Tuve who had taken shrapnel in the abdomen and whose intestines Hang had to pack back inside with boiled gauze because there was no surgeon within 50 kilometers. The woman survived 3 days before sepsis took her. Hospital beds were wooden planks. IV fluids were glass bottles suspended from nails driven into the ceiling joists. Hang learned to insert catheters by feel in near-total darkness, her fingers memorizing the anatomy because her eyes were useless. When the generator failed, which it did twice in the first week, she worked by candlelight, the flames casting jittering shadows that made every patient look like a corpse. On February 25th, a convoy of wounded arrived from Kailua, a neighborhood where door-to-door fighting had turned streets into abattoirs. The soldiers described bayonet work in narrow hallways, the air thick with chipped whitewash and splinters, the street dogs howling after midnight barrages. One man, a corporal named Dung, had fought for 18 hours straight in a tobacco shop turned strongpoint. He had taken a rifle round through the thigh and kept firing until the bone broke and he collapsed. The stretcher team found him behind a pile of sandbags, unconscious, his rifle still loaded. Hang cleaned the wound, a through and through that had shattered the femur, and realized she had no anesthetic, no surgical tools beyond a scalpel and forceps, and no blood for transfusion. She improvised a splint from bamboo and cloth, tied it tight enough to immobilize the leg, and prayed infection wouldn't set in. Dung woke up screaming. She held him down with help from 2 other nurses and whispered the only comfort she knew. "You're alive! You're alive!" He stopped screaming, but didn't stop shaking. Civilian casualties came too. An elderly man from Van Quan arrived with both legs crushed beneath a collapsed wall. A girl, maybe 12, with shrapnel in her lungs, drowning in her own blood. Hang worked without stopping, her hands moving through motions she no longer consciously controlled, until someone pulled her away and forced her to drink water and eat a handful of cold rice. She vomited it up 10 minutes later and went back to work. The PLA shelling struck at a rate of 3,000 to 5,000 rounds per day on some sectors during the first week. Vietnamese counter-battery fire used 85mm and 130mm guns positioned on reverse slopes, firing blind based on coordinates radioed in by forward observers. The duel was inefficient and brutal. For every Chinese gun silenced, 2 more opened up. The earth shook constantly. Dust hung in the air like fog. Hang learned to distinguish shells by sound, the high whistle of 122s, the deeper roar of 152s, the stuttering crack of rocket artillery that came in salvos and left craters wide enough to bury a truck. On February 27th, a monk from Loc Bin arrived at the school basement carrying 17 wounded men's hands wrapped in torn altar cloth. He had worked through the night in a pagoda converted to an aid station, using silk prayer banners as bandages and rice wine as disinfectant. He spoke softly, his voice hoarse, and told Hang that the pagoda had taken a direct hit an hour after he left. Everyone inside was dead. She assigned him a corner of the basement and watched him kneel beside a wounded soldier, whispering prayers in Pali while he cleaned a shrapnel wound. The juxtaposition, ancient chants and modern trauma, struck her as obscene and holy in equal measure. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did neither and returned to her work. Vietnamese engineers rebuilt infrastructure under fire. The Kai Kung pontoon crossing was reconstructed in 36 hours, using 24 aluminum boats and 300 meters of decking, enabling truck traffic by the fourth day of repairs. The work happened at night, teams wading chest-deep in freezing water to anchor the boats while mortars walked across the riverbank. 3 engineers drowned when a shell hit the water 10 meters upstream, the concussion rupturing their lungs. Their bodies floated downstream and were recovered 2 days later, swollen and unrecognizable. Radios were a lifeline and a curse. Vietnamese units used American PRC-25s and 77s, relics from the previous war, alongside Soviet R-105s. Batteries died in the cold and wet. Operators warmed them in their armpits or against their chests, trying to coax one more transmission before the charge failed. When radios went silent, runners carried messages in film canisters, averaging 6 to 9 kilometers in 70 to 110 minutes across terraced fields. Some never arrived. Whether killed by shelling, snipers or mines, no one knew. Picture yourself in that basement, the lamp guttering, the smell clawing at your throat, and the knowledge that tomorrow will bring more wounded than you can save. Hang worked until her hands stopped shaking, which meant she never stopped working, and when the school took a direct hit on March 1st, she was buried under rubble for 4 hours before a rescue team dug her out. She went back to work the next day. A single B-41 gunner crouched in a drainage ditch in Kai Lua at dawn on March 2nd, his wrist broken from a fall during the retreat the night before, and watched 2 Type 59 tanks idle 30 meters up the street. Vietnamese anti-armor tactics evolved from necessity and terrain. The karst landscape forced Chinese columns into predictable corridors, roads that hugged cliff walls, bridges that couldn't be bypassed, hairpin turns where tanks slowed to walking pace. Vietnamese commanders exploited this ruthlessly, positioning teams with rocket-propelled grenades at overlapping angles, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned every choke point into a killing ground. The chalk X marks on walls weren't decorative. They were algebra written in death. Distance plus angle plus penetration equals 1 dead tank. The gunner's name was Tuan. He was 19 years old and had learned to fire the B-41 during 2 weeks of training that consisted mostly of watching someone else do it, then doing it once himself with a practice round that didn't explode. Now he had 1 rocket left. His wrist screamed every time he moved, and the tanks were advancing toward a sandbagged position where 8 of his squadmates were dug in. If he missed, they died. If he hesitated, they died. If he lived through the next 60 seconds, he would spend the rest of his life replaying them. He shouldered the launcher with his good hand, bracing the tube against his hip because his broken wrist couldn't support the weight. The lead tank's turret swung left, searching. Tuan aimed for the turret ring, the weak joint where armor met chassis, and squeezed the trigger. The backblast kicked up a storm of mud and shattered brick. The rocket flew straight, trailing smoke, and punched through the turret at an angle that sent the warhead into the ammunition storage. The tank erupted. Flame vomited from the hatches. The crew tried to bail out. 2 made it before the secondary explosion turned the interior into a furnace. The second tank reversed, its driver panicking, and Tuan dropped the empty launcher and crawled backward through the drainage ditch, his broken wrist dragging in filthy water that tasted of diesel and rot. He heard machine gun fire stitching the ground behind him, rounds sparking off cobblestones, but he kept crawling, kept moving, until he reached a collapsed storefront and rolled inside. He lay there gasping, his vision greying at the edges, and listened to his squad open fire from their position. The second tank burned 10 minutes later. Someone else had made the shot. Vietnam claimed to destroy hundreds of Chinese tanks and armoured fighting vehicles during the war. Conservative Western counts suggest dozens. Historians debate the totals, but the tactical reality was consistent. Tanks died at close range in urban environments and narrow defiles, knocked out at 20 to 80 meters by teams that accepted suicidal odds as standard procedure. The doctrine was simple: let them get close, make the first shot count, Escape if you can, die if you must. Mines compounded the carnage. The soil around Zhongjiang was seeded with ordnance from 3 wars. American M14 toe poppers that severed feet, Pomzer fragmentation mines that shredded legs, and locally fabricated bamboo stake traps smeared with buffalo dung to guarantee infection. Garden plots became minefields. Footpaths became death sentences. PLA infantry advanced in single file, prodding the ground with bayonets, and still lost men to devices buried a decade earlier by farmers who were now fighting again. The PLA adapted with massed infantry rushes covered by artillery. 122mm and 152mm guns hammered Vietnamese positions before waves of soldiers stormed forward, accepting casualties as the price of momentum. The tactic worked in open terrain but faltered in towns where every building became a fortress and every street a funnel. In Kailua, the fighting devolved into room clearing with bayonets and grenades. Men died in doorways, on staircases, in closets where they had taken cover. The walls wept plaster dust. Blood pooled in the corners. The air thickened with smoke and the copper stink of wounds. Vietnamese women's militia, Dan Quan Tuve, fought alongside regular troops. They directed traffic under fire, filled sandbags between barrages, and manned 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine guns from sandbagged nests. One woman in Van Quan, 19 years old, tallied 2 kills with a single burst when a Chinese patrol crossed an intersection at dusk. She described the moment years later with flat affect. They ran, she fired, they fell. She didn't feel anything until later that night when she tried to eat rice and couldn't stop shaking long enough to bring the spoon to her mouth. Satchel charges became the weapon of choice for close assault. Vietnamese sappers assembled them from 3 to 5 kilograms of TNT with bamboo handles and fuses cut to 5 to 7 seconds, long enough to throw, short enough to deny the enemy time to react. Teams crawled to within grenade range of Chinese positions and lobbed the charges through windows or over walls. The explosions were massive, the concussion enough to collapse lungs and rupture eardrums within 10 meters. Survivors staggered out bleeding from the nose and ears, disoriented, easy targets. On the night of March 3rd, a Vietnamese sapper platoon allegedly crawled under parked PLA trucks near Nha Sam and chain-fused 6 vehicles using DETI cords strung like Christmas lights. The charges detonated at 2 a.m., igniting fuel tanks and ammunition stores in a cascading cook-off that lasted 20 minutes. The sky lit orange. Mortar rounds popped like firecrackers. Tracers spiraled into the night. The sappers withdrew through a ravine, none of them speaking, their ears ringing so badly they communicated with hand signals for the next 12 hours. The 338th Division mounted counterattacks at Tam Lung and Chimar between March 1st and 3rd, using 85mm field guns in direct fire against Stonehouse Corners, where Chinese troops had dug in. The artillery crews worked without cover, manhandling the guns into position under rifle fire, slamming shells into the breach as fast as loaders could feed them. They knocked down buildings wholesale, burying defenders in rubble, then followed with infantry assaults that cleared survivors at bayonet range. Casualty rates were appalling on both sides. The village changed hands twice in 36 hours before Vietnamese forces held it for good. Communication broke down constantly. PLA sappers cut telephone lines. Vietnamese runners carried messages in film canisters, averaging 6 to 9 kilometers in 70 to 110 minutes across terraced fields cratered by artillery. Some runners made 5 trips in a single day. Others died on the first. No one tracked the statistics because there was no one left to care. Imagine running through shell fire with coordinates folded in a tin canister, knowing that if you fall, an entire company goes silent and dies without support. Tuan spent 4 days in the rubble of Kailua with a broken wrist, before a medic splintered it with strips of bamboo and sent him back to the line with a rifle he could barely hold. He killed 3 more men before the Chinese withdrew, and he never learned their names. The city administrative offices in Lạng Sơn evacuated 18 hours before the Chinese entered, on March 5, 1979, leaving behind only sandbagged strongpoints at key crossroads and a handful of rearguard units with orders that everyone understood meant death. Lạng Sơn sat at the confluence of strategic necessity and geographic vulnerability. The city controlled the southern approach to the border, anchored the eastern defense line, and served as the logistical hub for Vietnamese forces across 3 provinces. Its loss would open a direct corridor to Hanoi, only 140 kilometers south. Beijing knew this, Hanoi knew this, and the soldiers fighting street to street in the final days of February knew they were buying time measured in hours, not days. The battle for Lạng Sơn unfolded across 5 days of incremental collapse. Vietnamese defenders, regular army, militia and volunteers, held intersections with interlocking fire from machine gun nests positioned in second-story windows and rooftop positions. They wired buildings with explosives and collapsed them onto advancing infantry. They fired from spider holes cut into garden walls, then withdrew through tunnels dug beneath shop cellars. The PLA responded with methodical destruction, levelling blocks with artillery before sending infantry to clear the rubble. By March 2nd, Chinese forces had encircled the city on 3 sides, leaving only the southern highway open for retreat. Civilians streamed out in columns that stretched for kilometres, old men pushing handcarts piled with cooking pots and ancestral tablets, mothers carrying children too young to walk, buffalo herded by boys who kept glancing back at the smoke rising over their neighbourhoods. The exodus moved at the pace of exhaustion. People collapsed beside the road and lay there until someone pulled them upright or they died where they fell. Inside the city, the defenders fought with the desperation of men who understood mathematics. A company of 120 might hold a city block for 6 hours against a battalion-strength assault, but the calculus always ended the same way. Ammunition depleted, casualties mounted, survivors withdrew. The question was not whether to retreat, but when, and how many would make it out. A sergeant named Hung commanded a strongpoint at the Lạng Sơn market, a stone building fortified with sandbags and firing slits cut through 2-foot-thick walls. His squad, 9 men and 2 women from the local militia, had held the position for 3 days, repelling probes and small assaults, while rationing ammunition to 10 rounds per rifle per engagement. They ate cassava and pickled mustard greens from tins scavenged from the market stalls, and they drank rainwater collected in helmets because the municipal supply had been cut on day 1. On the morning of March 4th, Chinese loudspeakers began broadcasting Vietnamese language, appeals to surrender, the voice smooth and reasonable, promising food and medical care and safe passage home. The volume measured 90 to 95 decibels, loud enough to rattle window panes. Hung's squad replied by dragging a looted radio from a nearby shop, wiring it to a truck battery, and blasting Kai Luong opera at maximum volume, the high, keening vocals of traditional theatre drowning out the propaganda. The absurdity of it, dying to opera, made one of the militia women laugh until she cried. The final assault began at 1400 hours. Artillery pounded the market for 30 minutes, 122mm shells that walked systematically across the block, collapsing roofs and punching through walls. Hung huddled in the basement with his squad, the earth heaving, dust pouring from the ceiling joists. When the barrage lifted, they climbed back to their positions and found half the building gone. The western wall had collapsed into the street. The machine gun nest on the 2nd floor was a crater. 2 of his squad were buried in rubble. Chinese infantry advanced through the smoke, using the wreckage for cover, firing as they moved. Hung's remaining fighters opened up from the intact eastern side of the building, automatic rifle fire and grenades that forced the attackers to ground. But more came, always more. The PLA fed soldiers into the breach with industrial efficiency, accepting losses as overhead, and within an hour Hung was down to 4 effectives and 30 rounds of ammunition. He gave the order to withdraw. They went out the back through a gap blown in the wall by an earlier shell, crawling through a courtyard littered with spent casings and bloodstains, then running down an alley that stank of garbage and death. Machine gun fire chased them. Hung felt rounds crack past his head, heard the wet smack of a bullet hitting flesh, and kept running. One of the women fell. He didn't stop to check if she was alive. They reached the southern highway at dusk and joined the retreat, a river of soldiers and civilians moving south under sporadic artillery fire. The column walked through the night, feet blistering, legs cramping, lungs burning from exertion and smoke inhalation. No one spoke. They shuffled forward in silence, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the distant thunder of guns still firing in the city they had abandoned. Lạng Sơn fell completely on March 5th. The PLA raised their flag over the provincial headquarters and began the systematic looting of whatever remained. Warehouses were emptied, rail yards were stripped, anything of strategic value was destroyed or shipped north. The occupation would last less than 2 weeks, but the humiliation burned deeper than any artillery barrage. Vietnamese after-action reports highlighted critical shortfalls. Anti-tank rounds had been expended at 2 to 3 times the planned rates. Medical stretchers averaged only 0.6 per squad. Communications equipment failed at rates approaching 50% due to water damage and enemy action. The lessons were written in blood: better waterproofing, more rockets, redundant communication lines. But lessons learned after defeat taste like ash. Refugee trains ran south from Bac Giang at night, with lights blacked out, packed beyond capacity, every seat and aisle filled with bodies pressed together in shared misery. One woman from Lạng Sơn remembered her daughter vomiting from motion sickness and terror, the smell of bile mixing with coal smoke that seeped through every crack in the car. She remembered the silence, hundreds of people crammed into darkness, swaying with the train's motion, listening for the whistle of incoming shells that never came but might at any second. Think of walking away from your home with everything you own in a cloth sack, knowing you will never see it again, knowing the people you left behind are already dead or dying. Hanoi established defence belts in depth by late March. Trench lines, wire obstacles and pre-sighted mortars staged every 3 to 5 kilometres along key valleys. The strategy was Soviet-style defence in depth, trade space for time, bleed the enemy at every layer, preserve forces for counterattack. But first, they had to stop the bleeding. The fall of Lạng Sơn marked the deepest penetration of the war, and in Beijing, leaders debated whether to push toward Hanoi or declare victory and withdraw. In Hanoi, General Van Tien Dung was already planning the counteroffensive that would determine whether Vietnam survived as an independent state or became a Chinese protectorate. China declared its lesson taught on March 5th and 6th, 1979, and the withdrawal orders came within hours, but pulling 200,000 troops out of hostile territory proved harder than sending them in. The phrase "Day cho Vietnam mot bai hoc," teach Vietnam a lesson, had been Deng Xiaoping's justification from the beginning. The stated goal was to punish Hanoi for toppling the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and to test Soviet resolve without triggering direct superpower confrontation. By early March, Beijing had achieved partial success on both counts. Vietnamese forces were battered, border provinces devastated, and Moscow had done nothing beyond posturing warships in the Gulf of Tonkin and airlifting ammunition to Gia Lam. But the cost had been brutal, and the lesson ambiguous at best. The PLA withdrawal was systematic and vengeful. Engineers blew rail yards, warehouses, bridges, and anything of strategic or economic value. In Lạng Sơn, demolition teams wired the provincial administrative building, the main hospital, and 3 schools. The explosions came at dawn on March 7th, timed for maximum psychological impact. Smoke pillars visible for kilometres, telling the returning civilians exactly what their liberation would look like. In Cao Bằng, Chinese forces destroyed the electrical substation, the water treatment plant, and 6 kilometres of Highway 4A. The message was clear: you won, but you won rubble. Vietnamese forces harried the retreat. Small units set ambushes along withdrawal routes, targeting supply columns and rearguards with hit-and-run attacks that bled the PLA all the way back to the border. Mines left behind by withdrawing Chinese engineers killed Vietnamese soldiers and civilians indiscriminately for months afterward. A farmer in Yongjang lost both legs to a POMZ mine in April while trying to plough a field that had been no man's land 3 weeks earlier. The wars within wars never truly ended, they just moved underground. Casualty figures remain disputed. Vietnamese claims of 62,500 Chinese casualties are likely inflated. Western estimates range lower. Some historians suggest 20 to 30,000 killed and wounded, though exact numbers are impossible to verify given both governments' incentives to manipulate the data. Vietnam acknowledged over 10,000 military and civilian casualties, but that figure almost certainly undercounts the true cost. Many bodies were recovered weeks later from collapsed masonry, burned-out buildings, and wells used as mass graves. Identification teams in late March and April used enamel bowls and chalk to sort bone fragments. Families waited months for remains, sometimes receiving only a tin of soil and a notation of where their son or daughter had fallen. The war lasted 28 days from the initial barrage on February 17th to the formal withdrawal on March 16th. But the fighting didn't stop. Border skirmishes persisted from 1979 through 1989, a decade-long slow bleed of artillery duels, patrol clashes, and hill assaults that cost thousands more lives over terrain measured in meters. The 1984 Visuyen battles alone killed thousands over 1.5 to 2 kilometers of granite ridges that had no strategic value beyond the psychological imperative to hold ground already paid for in blood. Vietnamese troops called one ravine in Visuyen Thung Lungoi Hon, Valley of Calling Souls, after retrieving over 200 remains in a single week. The bodies had been there since the initial fighting, exposed to monsoon rains and scavengers, reduced to fragments that required forensic patients to identify. A burial detail sergeant described the work as archaeology in reverse, digging up the recent past, cataloguing the dead, and trying to return names to bones. The smell of Visuyen in 1984 was wet granite, decomposition, and cordite. Trees were shorn to charred poles by sustained fire. Maps labelled one elevation Joy Thit Bam, Minced Meat Hill, because the soil was more bone dust than dirt. Veterans reported hearing loss by age 30 to 35. Tinnitus from 130mm guns echoing 10 to 12 seconds between cast walls. The sound became internalized, a ringing that never stopped, a souvenir more permanent than any medal. Politically, the war pushed Hanoi deeper into Moscow's orbit. The Treaty of Friendship, signed November 3, 1978, became an anchor. Soviet aid spiked in 1979 and 1980. Fuel, ammunition, radar sets, and economic credits that kept Vietnam afloat while facing embargoes from China, ASEAN, and the West. The price was dependency. Vietnam traded colonial subjugation for superpower patronage, and the difference felt thinner with every passing year. China's strategic calculus was more complex. Beijing had demonstrated its willingness to use force against a Soviet ally without triggering World War III. Deng had claimed domestically that Chinese strength had been reasserted after decades of perceived weakness, but the PLA's performance had been mixed at best. Logistical failures, communication breakdowns, unacceptably high casualties against a smaller force fighting on home terrain. The lessons learned would reshape Chinese military doctrine for the next decade, prioritizing mechanization, combined arms, and professional NCO corps over mass infantry tactics. Vietnamese propaganda posters in March 1979 depicted militia women in conical hats, raising SKS rifles, slogans proclaiming victory and resistance. Print runs reportedly topped 50,000 in Hanoi and Haiphong. The posters papered over the trauma, entire villages erased, families scattered, economies shattered, with nationalist triumphalism that rang hollow to anyone who had seen Lạng Sơn burning or carried a friend's body out of the rubble. Border churches and pagodas served as aid posts during the fighting and memorial sites afterward. A monk in Loc Binh recounted wrapping 17 wounded hands in one night with torn altar cloth, the silk stained rust brown. The prayers whispered over men who didn't hear them because they were unconscious or dying. The sacred space became triage, and the sacred objects became bandages, and no one questioned it, because survival erased the boundaries between holy and profane. What does victory mean when your city is ash and your children are orphans? The withdrawal ended on March 16th, but the war's aftershocks reverberated for years. Landmines in rice paddies, families searching for graves, veterans waking at 3 a.m. to phantom artillery that never stopped firing. China had taught a lesson. Vietnam had learned it, and neither side could agree on what it meant. A village elder in Trang Dinh buried the 1954 Geneva Accords flag in his garden when the Chinese artillery started falling, and on March 10, 1979, he dug it up with his bare hands and hoisted it over a crater, while shells still landed 300 meters away. Post-war reconstruction began before the war officially ended. Vietnamese engineers prioritized Highway 1 bridges and Lang Son rail yards because without transportation, the northern provinces would starve. Freight tonnage returned to approximately 60% of pre-war levels by late 1980, a recovery built on night shifts, improvised materials, and the kind of exhausted determination that comes from having no alternative. Youth volunteers repaired tracks by kerosene lamp, hammering spikes into salvaged ties, while sappers swept the roadbeds for mines that Chinese demolition teams had scattered during the withdrawal. Many villagers returned to smashed hearths and found nothing but foundations. Roof tiles were stacked in 200-piece bundles and rationed because the kilns had been destroyed. Lime wash was allocated at 1 bucket per block in early repairs, forcing families to choose between coating interior walls or exterior facades. Most chose interior. The outside could stay scorched, but inside you needed to feel human. The smell of wet lime and crushed brick became the scent of recovery, overlaying the older stench of cordite and decay. Vietnamese casualty graves at Khao Lam and Tam Than were marked with thin cement tablets. Names were penciled first, then chiselled weeks later when tools arrived. Some tablets listed only a unit number and a date because identification had been impossible. Bodies burned beyond recognition, or buried under rubble that took months to excavate, or simply lost in terrain too dangerous to search. Families came to the cemeteries with incense and sticky rice offerings, praying to markers that might or might not hold their son, their husband, their daughter. Memorial days in Lạng Sơn province each March gather 2,000 to 5,000 people under bomb-scarred banyan trees that somehow survived when everything around them burned. Incense smoke rises in grey columns. Offerings of fruit and rice wine cover stone altars. Old women kneel in the dirt and weep for sons who would be 60 years old now if they had lived. Veterans stand in small groups, speaking quietly, smoking cigarettes, their hearing aids whistling feedback. The young attend out of obligation or curiosity, trying to connect with a history that feels both immediate and impossibly distant. The conflict imprinted a decade. Schoolchildren learned air raid drills, diving under desks at the sound of a whistle, hands over heads, mouths open to equalize pressure in case of nearby detonation. Militia rosters stayed posted on commune gates until 1989. Names rotated as men aged, out or died, replaced by the next generation. The war became normalized, a background hum of violence that shaped daily life without dominating it. Border firefights from 1980 to 1989 followed predictable rhythms. Artillery duels at dawn, patrol clashes at dusk. Locals learned to count 4 to 6 seconds between flash and thump to judge distance, a skill that should never be necessary and became universal. Veterans reused captured Chinese shovels stamped with 1978 manufacturing dates. Some units kept them in barracks shrines as Chien Loi Pham, war trophies, alongside spent shell casings, torn flags, and photographs of the dead. The shrines were half memorial, half museum, entirely personal. They said, "This happened. We were there. They died. We didn't." Lantern-lit letters home during the war had taken 5 to 10 days to reach Hanoi, smelling of damp ink and coal smoke from train boilers. After the war, letters from the front became letters to the dead, placed on altars and burned so the smoke could carry the words to wherever the souls had gone. A mother in Cao Bằng wrote monthly letters to her son for 3 years after his death before she stopped. The letters said ordinary things, crop yields, marriages, births, because she didn't know what else to say to a ghost. Today, roadside markers on Highway 1 list battle sites in kilometres. Zhongzhang, 3 kilometres. Kailua, 1 kilometre. Quiet stone slabs, weathered and moss-covered, where in 1979 engines screamed and walls bled dust. Tourists occasionally stop to photograph them, mistaking history for scenery. Veterans drive past without stopping because they don't need a marker to remember. The war hardened Hanoi's stance but also spurred doctrine shifts. After-action reports documented shortfalls and proposed solutions, more anti-armour teams per company, better civil military evacuation drills, cave hospital kits, pre-positioned in border provinces with sealed medical supplies and communications equipment. The lessons were implemented slowly, constrained by budget and bureaucracy, but they were implemented. The next war, if it came, would be fought differently. Casualty identification teams in 1979 and 1980 used enamel bowls and chalk to sort bone fragments, excavated from collapsed buildings and mass graves. The work was meticulous and soul-destroying. Families waited months for remains, sometimes receiving only a small tin of soil from the battlefield and a certificate stating that their loved one had been determined deceased rather than confirmed killed. The ambiguity was its own torture, hope that persisted against all logic, grief that couldn't fully settle because certainty never came. Can you imagine opening a tin and being told it contains the earth where your child died, and that this is all you will ever have? The Sino-Vietnamese War killed tens of thousands over 28 days in 1979, then killed thousands more over the next decade in a slow attrition that never made international headlines. Border skirmishes became routine, artillery exchanges at dawn, patrol ambushes at dusk, small battles over hills with numbers instead of names, Hill 685, Hill 412, where the only thing worth fighting for was the principle that you couldn't let the other side win. Veterans reported tinnitus that never stopped, hearing loss that worsened with age, nightmares that recycled the same images for 40 years. They reported survivors' guilt, why them and not me, and the inability to explain to anyone who wasn't there what it felt like to be 19 years old and terrified and holding a rifle in the dark while the world exploded around you. The war ended. The war never ended. Both things were true. The silence after the guns stopped was louder than the artillery had ever been, and in that silence both nations tried to convince themselves they had won. The Sino-Vietnamese War became a historical footnote in Western consciousness, a minor border conflict between communist states overshadowed by the Cold War's grander narratives. But for Vietnam and China, the 28 days of 1979 and the decade of skirmishes that followed became defining traumas that shaped military doctrine, foreign policy, and national identity for generations. The war settled nothing. It answered no questions. It merely established that both sides were willing to kill and die over principles neither could clearly articulate. Internationally, ASEAN states condemned the Chinese invasion, but also criticized Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia, leaving Hanoi diplomatically isolated. The contradiction was deliberate. Regional powers feared Chinese expansionism, but also distrusted Vietnamese ambitions. Vietnam faced tightened embargoes while seeking Comecon credit lines from the Soviet bloc, trading one form of dependency for another. The economic cost was staggering. Reconstruction absorbed resources that could have rebuilt the war-shattered economy. Military spending remained inflated through the 1980s, preparing for a second Chinese invasion that never came but might at any moment. The border normalized into a state of controlled hostility. Trench lines, wire obstacles, and pre-sighted mortars became permanent features of the landscape. Defense belts extended in depth every 3 to 5 kilometers along key valleys, successive layers of fortification designed to bleed an attacker through attrition. Artillery duels at dawn became routine enough that farmers learned to time their work around the shelling. Plant rice before 6 a.m., take cover between 6 and 8, resume work after 9. War became weather, something you planned around but couldn't control. Vietnamese veterans carried the war in their bodies, hearing loss from sustained artillery fire, shrapnel fragments working their way to the surface decades later, the body slowly expelling metal it couldn't digest, lung damage from breathing smoke and cordite and burning plastic. But the psychological wounds cut deeper. PTSD wasn't diagnosed or treated. You were expected to return to civilian life and function as if nothing had changed. Many couldn't. Alcoholism rates among veterans climbed. Suicide rates climbed. Divorce rates climbed. The men who survived the war often couldn't survive the peace. A veteran named Than, who had fought in the Kai Lua neighborhood, returned home to Hanoi in April 1979 and worked as a bicycle mechanic for 30 years. He never spoke about the war except once, drunk at a family gathering in 2003, when he described watching a friend burn to death inside a tank and being unable to do anything except listen to the screaming. He finished the story, put down his glass and walked out. His family didn't see him for 3 days. When he came back, no one asked where he'd been. The conflict through schoolchildren learned became sanitized narrative. Heroic defense, glorious sacrifice, ultimate victory. Textbooks emphasized Vietnamese resilience and Chinese brutality, while eliding the chaos, the incompetence, the friendly fire incidents, the terror. History became propaganda, and propaganda became truth through repetition. Generations grew up knowing the war happened but not knowing what it meant, the gap between official memory and lived experience widening with each passing year. China conducted its own revision. The PLA's poor performance, logistical failures, high casualties, inability to achieve decisive victory, was attributed to systemic problems that required comprehensive military reform. The lesson China learned was not about Vietnam but about itself. The People's Liberation Army was unprepared for modern warfare. The subsequent modernization program transformed the Chinese military into the force it is today, making the 1979 war a catalyst for change that Vietnam's sacrifice inadvertently enabled. The irony is sharp enough to draw blood. Vietnam won tactically but lost strategically. China lost tactically but won strategically. And the dead remained dead regardless of who claimed victory. Border normalization came gradually through the 1990s after the Cold War ended, and both governments decided that trade was more profitable than war. Diplomatic relations restored. Border crossings reopened. The same valleys where men had killed each other over meters of ground became tourist destinations, scenic vistas photographed by people with no memory of what the rocks had witnessed. Progress, perhaps, or erasure. Veterans on both sides occasionally meet now at official reconciliation events, shaking hands for cameras while avoiding eye contact. The encounters are awkward and painful. What do you say to someone who tried to kill you 40 years ago? Thank you for missing. I'm glad you survived. Sorry about your leg. The script doesn't exist, so they mouth pleasantries and retreat to their separate hotels, each side relieved when it's over. The Sino-Vietnamese War demonstrated that small nations can resist superpowers through terrain, tactics, and willingness to accept catastrophic losses. It demonstrated that wars fought for abstract principles, teaching lessons, defending honor, proving resolve, produce concrete suffering with ambiguous results. It demonstrated that victory and defeat are often indistinguishable when measured in graves. If you were 20 years old in 1979, you are 65 now. The war is not memory but history, something that happened to someone else, somewhere else, a long time ago. Except it isn't. The veterans are still alive. The widows are still alive. The children who hid in caves while their villages burned are alive and have children of their own. The war is not distant past. It is living tissue, still bleeding beneath scar tissue that never fully healed. The final truth is simpler and harder than any lesson. Wars end, but they don't finish. They echo forward through generations, shaping families and nations in ways too diffuse to measure and too persistent to ignore. The Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 lasted 28 days, and it will last as long as anyone remains who remembers the sound of the barrage at 3:30 a.m. on February 17th, when the earth cracked open and everything changed. The guns are silent now. The men who fired them are dying, and the karst ridges stand unchanged, indifferent witnesses to human folly, waiting for the next war that history promises will eventually come, because it always does.